There's a shift in mental health, and it's a really good thing. It's okay to see a therapist. It's okay to even like look at some medicine if that's something you need, right? There's nothing special about me, just basically like consistency and a good mentor, and you can move that ball forward quicker than you think. Because I'll tell you the worst case, you lose all your money, and that would be miserable. That is technically possible. Just to have someone in your corner to say, yes, I know you feel overwhelmed. I did too. And here's how I'm gonna help you get through that. Those kinds of things are incredibly valuable. But I will tell you, my life would be nowhere near what it's like now without having that mentorship. We have really nothing to hide. There's no gain in lying. So let's just be extremely honest. And people are trusting you, so be trustworthy, right? Even if it's bad news. That's one lesson that I've learned is like, people are trusting you, so just be honest, right? There are times when I've had to have very hard conversations. Be honest about the cash flow versus net worth gain. Just because the cash flow is pinched doesn't mean my net worth hasn't grown. There's nothing special about me. I was just like, every day I'm gonna do one thing to move the ball forward. I tell people, if you're gonna start right now, you're probably gonna be 6 months away from being ready for your first acquisition. It doesn't have to be this mountain of time, it has to be full-time. I believe you can do a good job in a 4 to 5 hour period, especially if you have a coach or mentor helping you see what are the next best steps to take. 2020 was where I decided, okay, I'm gonna do syndication. And what I decided was I'm gonna spend 4 to 5 hours a week. Surround yourself with people doing something similar, right? If you're surrounded by entrepreneurs, we're all a little bit crazy. So it's not as bad. Can I make it happen? Am I going to be able to put food on the table? I mean, am I going to be able to have income? I also think long-term, this has the ability to produce significantly more income than engineering ever. So real estate is a get-rich-slow game. Like I always tell people, like, if you go to a conference, you'll hear like, yay, quit your job and passive income and total freedom. And the reality is that's not totally true, right? Passive income is very slow to build.
Adventure, some crave it and some are afraid of it. No matter what, if you crave adventure or if you're afraid of it, we're going to talk about engineering adventure today with our guest, Eric Nelson, who's a pilot. He's traveled the world. He's built businesses and now a real estate empire. And he's also now coaching people on how to follow in his footsteps. I'm excited for our conversation today with Eric Nelson. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Alan. It's my absolute pleasure to be on. It's always an honor to be a guest, but I'm just really excited for our conversation. So thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Now, Eric, not too many people would take the word engineer and adventure and mash those together and think that that would work, but somehow you're making that work. So I'd love to know your background and then also how that maybe led into some of the adventures that you're having now.
Yeah, good question. I think, first of all, yeah, I mean, I think the funny thing about me being an engineer is like the way I describe it is I was doing what I was supposed to do. Like my parents were amazing. They're still amazing parents and grandparents. And that's part of the reason I have such an adventurous spirit. But, growing up, it was like kind of the same story that a lot of people are told is like get good grades, pick a degree, do the degree, and then get the job. And then like that's kind of the story you're pitched as a kid. And so I did that, and a few years into engineering, I'm kind of like, man, this is really dull. And this is like, I was a fine engineer, but it just was not, it was never like super exciting for me. So it wasn't too long into my career that I realized I want to do something else, right? And so what I basically started doing was sort of introducing travel into my life to sort of get myself out of the 9 to 5. I was sort of living for the weekends and then living for the next adventure, I guess you could say. And then at some point I started investing in real estate, and that's kind of the next chapter of my life. Was we had built a small portfolio of single families, and then we can go into that into whole detail, but basically for me personally, I just never really resonated with being a true engineer in the standard sense of the word. I mean, I was fine at it, but I was never super passionate. And so now my passions are real estate. They have been since I found it, and travel, and we do a whole lot of that. So those are kind of the two things I do now, along with coaching. But yeah, I know this is kind of a quick answer to that question, but it's true. Most engineers aren't known for being risk takers and really adventurous, but that is sort of my personality.
Well, there may be a stronger correlation there between engineers and risk taking or adventure, because I run into a lot of pilots at FBOs and at airfields that are also engineers. So maybe there's a stronger correlation there than we allow for. I just don't think that most people associate the word engineer with somebody that's out having adventures. Um, and there's probably a lot of people that are going to be listening that have done the same thing. They've gone through college or whatever their career path has been, and then whether it's an aha moment or maybe it just over time they're just realizing they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing. But I feel like there's a lot of people that just stay there because they don't know how to get out of what you could describe as either a groove or a rut. So was it scary for you to begin to make that change? Because the life of an engineer usually is pretty stable. You're going to get a paycheck. You can work 9 to 5 or whatever the schedule is. The life of an entrepreneur is the exact opposite of that. So what were some of the fears that you experienced as you made that transition?
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely true. And I mean, to say that the transition was easy or without fear is a lie, right? I mean, of course, there was lots of fear around, am I going to be able to make money? Am I going to be able to, have enough passive income to support my family? And and I think, the answer to the question is at some point you're just going to have to do it. And I like this is not an easy thing to be hearing, because if you're listening to this right now and you're like, man, I really don't like my job and I want to change. Like, I'll give a very good example. My friend's a physical therapist, and he doesn't like his job. And so he came to me maybe 2 months ago. I was like, hey, I'm looking at getting into sales or some other position, and I'm going to start applying for jobs. And it's super scary. And the thing is, if you think about it, he spent 10 years of his life going to school and a lot of money. And now he's 10 years into his career and he's like, I feel like I've hit the peak. And he's very good at it. He's like, there's just nowhere up from here. And so he wants to make this wholehearted change. And, the answer I gave him was like, here's the cool thing is, worst case scenario, let's say he goes into sales and you don't like it, or you fail or whatever, you can go back to what you were doing. Like, there's always going to be a position where you were most likely, and maybe not the exact same job in some capacity. So in some sense, there is sort of a fallback. But he was like, well, how do you like make the leap? I'm like, you just kind of do. I mean, I think it's worth it because you're following something that makes you way more happier and way more passion. The other thing too is like, I've learned to be a longer term vision person. So real estate's a get rich slow game. Like, I always tell people, like, if you go to a conference, you'll hear like, yay, quit your job and passive income and total freedom. And the reality is that's not totally true, right? Passive income is very slow to build. You can build some net worth, but that's not necessarily putting food on the table. So I think being very honest and real about, okay, I had to take a step back in yearly income to then propel forward. Now my net worth has grown, and that's fine, but that's not necessarily, again, like putting food on the table at the moment. That's for the future. But I also think long term, this has the ability to produce significantly more income than engineering ever could. There's going to be a ceiling there. I felt the same thing as my friend. I'm like, I'm at the peak of what we can charge hourly, and there's just not that much more I can go. Plus, I truly have to trade time for money. With real estate or some other gig, like even potentially sales, you could get to where your hourly time is worth quite a bit more. So again, I feel like I'm answering these very long-winded, but the fear for me was all the things you would expect. Can I make it happen? Am I going to be able to put food on the table? I mean, am I going to be able to have income? And like, there's some other fears too around like partnering. Like, if you're going to go all in on real estate, you're going to have to partner. I was a little bit fearful of that. I was fearful of taking people's money, for investments. There was a lot of fears around that, but eventually you just kind of have to say, all right, I've done all the research I can do. I've done all the podcast listening and book reading I can do. I'm just going to have to make it a go. And that's the advice I would give anyone, is make sure and get very educated and then just take the leap. And one of the final pieces I'll say is surround yourself with people doing something similar, right? If you're surrounded by entrepreneurs, we're all a little bit crazy. So it's not as bad.
Yeah, at least you have company in your craziness, right? It may not make it better, but at least you don't feel like you're left out or something. So
Yep.
how long a period of time for you was that investigating period, like the gaining knowledge, making contacts, maybe going to real estate meetups and stuff like that? And then after you made the decision, what did that look like initially? 'Cause I know for me, I made the decision. I sold a business and had no clue what I was going to do next. And then landed on real estate, kind of a joke that I got into it accidentally because I had to. But the first couple of years was not smooth, and it was more going backwards than going forwards. So did you experience the same thing? And if so, how did you push through that?
Um, I'm hesitating to answer because I was in a little bit of a unique position where I had started an engineering company. So I had a small company that I owned. And so for me, what I started to do was, first of all, we bought a few single families. So we had a little bit of success in single family world, and then we had a sixplex and a threeplex. And so I had a little bit of experience around small multifamily stuff. And so that was a little bit of an accelerator in the sense that, like, when I talk to investors, they'd say, "Is this your first syndication?" Of course, my answer is, "Yeah, this is." However, I do have a track record of a little bit of success doing this, and I have a mentor in my corner sort of watching me. So with those two things, I was able to answer honestly and also have some confidence in, all right, I think I can actually be successful even if this is my very first one. But what it looked like for me was slow. And maybe that's the engineer side of me. I spent so much time listening to podcasts, and I read a lot of real estate books to get extremely educated before I was like, all right, I'm ready to step into this. So, I will say I probably fit into that stereotype a little bit because I felt like I needed the knowledge before I would, accept any investor money, if that makes sense. So the time frame was, we had bought some single families, and then that like sixplex, I think it was 2019 area. 2020 was where I decided, okay, I'm going to do syndication. And what I decided was I'm going to spend 4 to 5 hours a week dedicated to that for as long as it takes until I feel comfortable sort of stepping back from engineering. And so I did sort of this mix. And that's actually what I tell people to do now. If you're going to start syndication, it doesn't have to be this mountain of time. It has to be full time. I believe you can do a good job in a 4 to 5 hour period, especially if you have a coach or mentor helping you see what are the next best steps to take. And so for me, it was strange timing. I started about January, February of 2020. And then obviously shortly after COVID changed everything, which if you think about it, actually in a weird way, it pushed everyone to Zoom. And so interacting on like gatherings online, talking with investors online, doing webinars, those things became way easier, which obviously is a terrible, terrible thing that happened. But that was one great benefit was everyone now knew what the word Zoom meant and was very comfortable with it. So you could host online webinars and your view spread. But anyway, so from January 2020, for me saying I'm gonna spend 4 hours a week, our first acquisition, we basically had the first deal in contract September of 20. So it took about 9 months of going to meetups. I even started a podcast. I was just trying to like get out there, talk to brokers, underwrite as many deals as I could. And I think that's a pretty standard timeline. Like I tell people, if you're going to start right now, you're probably going to be 6 months away from being ready for your first acquisition. And a lot of people are mad about that, especially like go-getters, especially people who are really high paced. They're like, oh, I can speed it up. Maybe, but if this is your side gig, right? If you keep in your W-2 and you're doing this on the side, I think that that's a pretty realistic timeline. And so that's about how long it took for me. Then to truly step away from my job took about a year and a half beyond that. So I'll say 2.5 years of dedication of 4 to 5 hours a week. And then by that time, we had about, I think, 5 acquisitions under our belt. So we had sort of, about 18 months, we did 5 deals, multifamily deals. It was enough for me to say, okay, I've got some passive income. I have enough track record where I think I can replace my income with this. And that's how long it took me. So I like to use myself as an example. There's nothing special about me. I was just like, every day I'm going to do one thing to move the ball forward. And I would say a 3-year time span to quit your job is a pretty realistic timeline. And again, I think people think that's forever, but I'm like, in the grand scheme, if you hate your job and this is a side thing, that's a pretty quick timeline, actually. I just like to be very honest about it. 3 years is very realistic.
And I think as I'm thinking through the timeline that you just walked through, uh, I think that's spot on. And I don't know what the chances of that are. But when we got really serious also about creating, we did a fund, not a syndication, but it took 9 months before we were comfortable enough with what we were offering and found a deal and started raising money. And as I look at the timeline of that opportunity, I think it's going to be about that 2 to 3 year period before there's sufficient income that I don't have to worry about doing something else on the side in order to pay the bills while I'm working on towards the future that's on my vision board. So I think you're absolutely right. I think it accelerates over time, right? Like you maybe have what feels like a long time to get started, but then once you gain momentum behind what you're doing, it can accelerate very quickly. So where are you at now? So your first acquisition took 9 months in 2020, it sounds like. And where does that put you today so we can see how quickly things can accelerate?
Yeah, and I think one interesting thing to say too is that I mean you're right. It is kind of like a hockey stick, not only in acquisitions but also in income. So for me now, we're closing on a deal in about 2 weeks. That'll be our 12th acquisition in about a 3 year timeline. So we're on a pace to do about four a year, and I think that's a realistic pace as well. The other thing to mention is there are dry spells where, like, let's say December of 22 to June of 23, we bought nothing because interest rates were going nuts, and it was very hard to find deals that penciled, and we weren't going to force it, right? But income wise, it was pretty stressful because there was no acquisition fees, and the cash flow truly is not a whole lot as a syndicator, especially if you have a preferred return. For those listening, I mean, preferred return means the first 6, 7, 8% goes to the investors before we make a penny. So if we haven't made 7% this year, we're not making a dime. So that's very common. Here's the interesting thing too is just because the cash flow is pinched doesn't mean my net worth hasn't grown. The way that it works as a GP is you're grabbing equity for your sweat, basically. You're grabbing sweat equity. So it's like for every deal you do, depending on your size of the piece of the GP, you have quite a bit of built-in equity the day that the deal closes. So my net worth has grown significantly, but the cash flow, it takes longer for that to go. So that's another piece of advice I give people is like, be honest about the cash flow versus net worth gain. I'm more confident in my retirement than I am in the cash flow in the next 6 months. This is kind of a reality of the business. And so to answer the question, we're on a pace to do about 4 to 5 acquisitions a year. That's a really good pace for us because one, we can handle it. It's not so overwhelming that we're like, oh my gosh, how are we ever going to raise money for that? How are we going to ever handle all of those deals, be a good asset manager? And to your other point, the acceleration happens also like we're going to sell our first property. So we'll go full cycle on our first one. It's under contract now. So it should sell, let's say, by this spring. That's a really exciting thing too, because that's when you really kind of cash in as a GP. You made your money. If you did a good job, when the property sells, then all of a sudden you're like, okay, whew, there's an actual decent chunk of income, right? And so that's when the acceleration will really happen. And so to make really good money in syndication, you have to have this 4 to 5 year vision. And that can be really challenging for people who are in a position who are really unhappy or maybe just, a little bit like myself. I'm a little bit like, I don't have a ton of patience, right? I want to have it speed now, but it is a get rich slow game. And so you have to have this like very long-term vision, which has helped me a whole lot.
I love that you draw that distinction between income and wealth because they're not the same thing. And you can accomplish both through real estate or through business, but you need to know what you're getting into also. And I have the same conversation with my wife as we're walking together in the morning as we're reviewing our family finances and said, well, in the 2 to 10 year plan, I'm totally confident in where we're going to be and what that's going to look like. I can see that really clearly. The 6 month to 2 year plan, well, there's going to be a few more, maybe some sacrifices to make along the way and maybe a few more bumps along the road, but we'll be okay. We'll get there. So I love that that was your experience and and congratulations on making full cycle on that first one, especially with the things that are happening in that multifamily space right now, where there are a lot of people that are not experiencing success, where they've maybe got into a deal over aggressively or didn't lock in their interest rates or whatnot. Um, how, when you were underwriting these deals in order to be conservative and prepare for, what nobody really knew was coming, but how did you structure things in a way to help protect yourself and your investors?
That's a good question. I mean, I think one of the things I'll say stereotypically about me as an engineer is I'm a numbers person. So, um, underwriting is really, really important to me and our team. But a handful of things that people I think forget is to prepare for the market to be significantly worse than when you bought it, right? And so, like, the exit cap rate is not talked about enough, I don't feel like, unless you're in a group of underwriters. But let's say, a property you're buying now, whatever the cap rate is, we're going to assume the cap rate's higher or worse market wise than when we sell it. We're also going to assume anytime we refinance that the rate's going to be higher. And that played in our benefit because, we were acquiring stuff in 2021, early 22 even, like the rates were so low, but we were expecting them to go up. Not nearly like they did, of course, but those two things alone, uh, increase in cap rate on the exit cap rate and an increase on a proposed interest rate, that helped us underwrite to a point to say, okay, if the market gets significantly worse and we still need to sell, which is exactly what's happened, um, we're still in a pretty good position. And what I tell people, and this is a pretty shocking number, is we on average have underwritten 300 deals for every one we buy, and that is a
Wow.
large number. I've gotten pretty fast at underwriting, but it becomes incredibly frustrating, right? Like for an underwriter, my partner Shane does more of it than I do, but that's a lot of time spent in a spreadsheet before you get a deal. And so that's, I think, for us is like just big numbers and a lot of conservative thinking, and then just being very honest with brokers. So here's another tip is, we're buying deals that we can assign or assume the note, and that's how we're selling this one too. So we're selling our property with a 3.6% interest rate. The new buyer's taken over that is still has another 5 years left on it. So that's a really attractive thing for the market. That's why we decided to sell. Was we have this really attractive offer that's 3.5% less than any other loan you could get that you can grab it and take over. So that's why we're selling those. But there's a couple other things that you could do, and I can get into the weeds a little bit more on underwriting, but those two things I think are really, really valuable. It's just assume the market's going to be worse when you're selling.
I think that's a great assumption. And I love that. I think too often there are people that, as an entrepreneur, you're naturally an optimistic person. You see the best case scenario, and it's a good check down to look for what could be the worst case scenario and plan for that while still maintaining the optimism and the hope for what could be the best. Um, at the beginning, you mentioned how kind of the first thing that you did to pull yourself out of the maybe monotony of your engineering job was traveling. Can you share some of the adventures that you've had while traveling? And has that been solo travel? Has that been with your family or a combination of the both? And maybe if there's a trip that stands out as just a great adventure, if you could share that.
Yeah, I mean, I have one that comes to the mind immediately. My wife and I, this is before kids, but I'll share one with kids too to prove that you can do it. But in 2015, which is, I understand 9 years ago, it's a long time, but we took a year off and we drove a little camper from Colorado to the bottom of Patagonia. And we took a
Wow.
year and it was about 30,000 miles of driving all the way down through a bunch of countries and just traveled for a year. And we just camped in this little 1982 camper that was not expensive or fancy, but we just went for it. And so that was quite the adventure. I mean, we learned a lot and we had some tough days, but generally we look back at it with just, one of the best years of our life for sure. So that one stands out. I've really been blessed to travel quite a bit of the world. I did some mission work as well, and that took me around the world. And then most recently, we took our kids to Mexico last year for a little over a month. And we just rented a little house near the beach, and we just kind of lived a small town Mexican life and ate a whole lot of tacos and spent a lot of time on the beach, and really just changed our life pace a little bit, which is totally doable. Our kids were 5 and 3 at the time. Now they're 6 and 4, but you can totally travel with kids. And what's funny about kids is they're super resilient. Like if you say, here's where we're sleeping tonight, my kids, and I think a lot of kids are like, okay, like so long as you're here, this is fine. As long as we have fun with it. So I think, maybe just American culture specifically, I think people make a big deal of traveling with kids. It's harder without question. It takes longer, way more packing, way more snacks. But generally, it's very doable, and kids love to travel too. At least that's my experience. So those are a handful of things that stick out, for sure.
That's awesome. I'd love to dive into that trip in a van all the way down to the end of the world in Patagonia. There are a lot of things that have to go right to make that happen, and a lot of things that could go wrong on that trip. And I feel like if the mention of that, even the idea of that to my wife would cause a panic attack for her. The amount of planning, and she's a great what if person. She always can foresee what potentially could go wrong and help us prepare for it. And that's her superpower. But how did you prepare for that? And then what were some of the things that you just couldn't have foreseen, both good and bad, that really added color to that experience for you?
Oh, I love it. Well, my wife's kind of similar, right? Like she's not quite as adventurous as I am, and to her credit, she has become that way. I think because she's gained just the same joy that I have for adventure. So when I pitched the idea, it was basically the same as reaction as your wife. She's like, no, like there's never gonna happen. Like, why would we even do that? Why would we even take time off of work? All those things, right? Um, but we read it. So this is a back before like van life was kind of more common. Like this was, there's also not really a great app for camping. We had one app that showed where you could camp, here and there along the way, which is really, really helpful. But we started reading blogs. So people had blogs, and there was one book that I was able to find of a couple who did this. And it was nice to say, look, we're not the first or the only people doing this. And it's not totally crazy, right? Like people have succeeded, and they've had fun. One thing that we thought about a lot was like, what if this car breaks down because it's old and it didn't have a lot of miles on it, honestly, only like 50,000 original miles, because this is like old camper, and this elderly couple had owned it. We paid $2,000 for it, by the way, so it was not a fancy thing. But I spent a lot of time like working on it to get it ready. So I put in a whole new water system, like some heat, like we put in a whole new bed and a new kitchen and stuff. So we kind of like renovated it, so to speak. And in doing that, I learned a lot about the car. And so I had this confidence of, I'll probably be able to fix most things that break. Now, I'll give you one example of one that was pretty cool. As we're coming into Mexico City, I start hear this like clinking sound. And I'm like, uh-oh, like this does not sound good. This is very, very bad sound. And so we're pulling into the city, and it's raining, and I know there's something wrong. And I park, and then literally like the car's running, and it just starts steaming. And like I'm like, oh no. I thought the radiator maybe like blew a cap or something. I didn't really know what happened. I get out of the car, and sure enough, antifreeze is all over the street. And my wife, she's really upset. And luckily we had parked at like a hostel, but she goes in and she comes back out and she's crying, and she's like, there's no room here. We can't stay. It's raining. And of course, this truck drives by and just sprays water up her back. It was like this whole hilarious story now. But at the time, she was not happy. But here's the coolest part of the story is this guy comes across the street and he goes, hey, there's a mechanic down the road. And he's speaking to me in Spanish, so my Spanish is mediocre. And I was like, okay, that's good to know. I'm like, I'm just going to try and fix it. I was kind of being stubborn. But after about 15 minutes, I'm like, I don't even know what I'm looking for here. I have to rely on trust. And so I walk down the street, and sure enough, I knock on this person's house. It was just a house. And he comes out, and he's like, oh, your car's broken? He's like, okay, well, let's push it over here. And he goes, just leave me the keys and I'll fix it tomorrow. And I was like, dude, and I told him in Spanish, I'm like, I'm leaving you the keys to my house. Like, I have nothing but to trust you. And so we splurged for a hotel that night. I remember we went to a Marriott. I remember everything about this detail because it was so vivid, which was such a splurge for us at the time. And I left him the keys, and I was like, we have no choice here but to leave you like everything we own and trust you. He goes, hey, cool, come back at 9 a.m. in the morning and we'll already be working on it. So sure enough, I go over there, and him and his son had found that it was a water pump that broke in, and they'd already been to the store and replaced the water pump. And by the time I got there, it was already running and fixed. And I was like, oh my God, that's amazing. He's like, oh no, it was only a few screws, like super easy for us. So I tried to pay him, and he goes, don't pay me. Just tell people that Mexico City is amazing. And I was like,
Wow.
this is the most incredible story in every way, full trust for people. And we found that to be true, like really along the way. Like the whole trip, we found people to be very amazing. And we get that question a lot, was like, what went wrong? And there were a handful of things, of course. Like we got pulled over, and some policemen were a little bit like, trying to get bribes. I had this like no bribe mentality, so I would just, I'd never paid a bribe. I would just sit there and be out like patient. I'd be like, you know what? Where's this? Where do I go for court? Like I would just kind of play that game, and we never paid a bribe the whole time. So there was a handful of those like annoying instances, but generally speaking, people were amazing to us as travelers, and we had such a wonderful experience around people. So hopefully that wasn't too long of a story, but it was just a kind of a cool lesson in general that like I believe people in general want to help you, especially if you put your trust in them.
How did that travel experience inform later experiences in life? Maybe how you treat people or interactions with investors, or what life lessons did you pull out of that 1 year? Because there have been so many things that just stuck with you from that type of an adventure.
Yeah, I love that question. And it's interesting. Like, I hadn't thought of that. And then one of my friends asked me a similar question. This was not that long ago, maybe like a year ago. I was like, wow, that's such a cool question, because absolutely that's the case. I mean, that's kind of what I just described as like putting a lot of trust in someone. That's sort of what I view investors doing for us. They're entrusting their hard-earned money with us. So if we miss the mark, which some properties are just going to underperform, it's just a reality. I owe it to them to own it, right? Like buck stops here. That like we're doing everything we possibly can. However, we're not providing the return we thought we would, and just be very clear and honest. And I think people can appreciate that. If you try and lie or sugarcoat or I don't know, dance around it, or maybe like not tell the truth in hopes that it gets better, that's one lesson that I've learned is like people are trusting you. So just be honest, right? There are times when I've had to have very hard conversations. One of our investors who come back like 5 times now, he called me. He goes, hey, what's up with this property? And the update was honest, but I was like, I'll give you the whole story. Like, and we share every bit of information. If someone wants to see the P&L, we'll share every penny of where our money's going. That's probably a lesson learned from a trip like this, is like, we have really nothing to hide. There's no gain in lying. So let's just be extremely honest, and people are trusting you. So be trustworthy, right? Even if it's bad news. So I think that's kind of one thing that came from it. The other thing too is like, if you think about it, a lot of times it's like, what's the worst case scenario? I like to play that game a lot. Or even a better question is, what's the most likely worst case scenario? And so people ask, they invest money with you. They say, what's the worst case? I say, I'll tell you the worst case, you lose all your money. And that would be miserable. That is technically possible. But the most likely worst case is that we don't hit the returns we say we do. So let's say you invest 50 grand and we think that we can more or less double your money in 5 years. Let's say after 5 years, we give you your money back plus an 8% return, which is not at all what we want. That's a more likely bad case scenario. And I'd feel bad for that, right? I would have made very little myself too. But that's a more likely worst case scenario. So I think that that's a good lesson to be learned, or a good question to ask, which comes from travel. Most travel, like that one I described, that's pretty adventurous. But most travel you do, especially let's say you're just going with your family somewhere, the most likely worst case scenario is your plane's delayed, or you don't get as much sleep as you think, or the hotel isn't as nice as you expected it to be. None of those things are really that detrimental, right? You can still have a wonderful time. So I think that question of what's the most likely worst case scenario is a good one.
That's awesome. Are there any places where you've traveled where you wouldn't want to go back, and why? And are there places where you're just dying to go back, and why would that be?
Man, I love these questions. I just love talking about travel. So I know, like, I could talk about real estate all the time and travel all the time. Okay, so I've been to India and I spent like 6 weeks there. And, in the city in New Delhi, it is very overwhelming for someone like me from a small town. It is like a mountain of people, and being like a tall white person in that country, you do tend to stick out. So people kind of want to come talk to you. And in one sense, it's like exciting. You're like, okay, well, I'm an outsider here. The food is so unique and different. It's so loud. It's so different. But on the other hand, it's completely overwhelming. And you tend to, most people I know who've been to India will describe they get sick. You tend to get sick from food. So it's pretty tough travel experience. So I wouldn't necessarily like be high on my list. But here's the thing: is I went to northern India and I did this trek, and I would say the Himalayas are like no other place on earth. I live in Colorado. Our mountains are amazing, but they're just so magical, and there's something about that zone that I would happily go back. So within, like, let's say a 9-hour bus ride, for me, like, they're wholeheartedly different experiences in the same country. So I'll use those two as example. Like, I would not like to go back to New Delhi, especially on the budget that I had. And I would love to go back to the Himalayan mountains, if I have the chance. So there's just a couple examples.
That's awesome. How does aviation play into your story? You're a pilot. I don't know anything more about that, so I would love to know when that started, what your experience is, and what you foresee as, your future with flying airplanes.
Yeah, so I mean, all cards on the table. I'm brand new, so I still fly a 172, and that's the only thing I know how to fly, and it's from the 50s. So I just fly around here. But my vision with it was, I think I saw Devin Elder was on your show, and he and I had this similar concept. I think he flies a helicopter actually with his family more often than an airplane. But my vision was to have a small, somewhat quick airplane that my family and I could get from like here to San Diego or here to Montana, or not have to worry about, one, TSA, and then two, just like timelines. We could just fly at our own pace and anytime we want and go pretty much anywhere, anytime. That was kind of the envision. It's, as I get into more aviation, it's not as easy as it sounds, and becoming a pilot is a lot of work. I've really enjoyed the process, but for me, for now, it's still so new that it's hard for me to really see the future. But I think that's the goal, is to get a small turbo plane that can get you up somewhere quick enough that we don't have to fly to Durango, because my small town, there's always a connection. And so it's like, if we could fly direct, like, here's an example, is like to drive to Telluride is 2.5 hours, but to fly even a slow plane is like 40 minutes. And that alone is like, well, it's a fun, cool thing to do as well. So long answer again to your question, but I don't really know where it will lead me in the future. For now, it's still a little bit of a hobby.
How does your wife feel about you flying?
she I think she thinks it's more dangerous than I do. We described this, like you were saying with your wife, is like she probably thinks like a little bit more worst case than me. The more I get into it, the more I realize, like, the checklists are there for a reason. There is some danger involved. I think she thinks it's a little more reckless than it is in reality. So I'm excited to spend more time with her in the plane and like get a little bit more educated. I think now, knowing that there are some outs and, detrimental situation would probably be fairly rare. But I think she's a little nervous still, probably because I'm still so new, right? Like, maybe if I get more skilled, she'll have more confidence.
Yeah. How many hours in are you?
Right around 100, I want to say, something like that.
Okay.
Maybe 120. I haven't looked at my logbook recently, but I want to ask these questions of you too. I know this is your show, so
Absolutely, fire away.
Like, yeah, well, I mean, like, what about you? What's your story as far as flying goes, and then how does your wife feel about it?
Well, I'll answer the second question first. So my wife's uncle was killed in a small plane crash. So I've always wanted to fly from the time my grandfather was in the Air Force. He was a master sergeant. I can remember going with him to Luke Air Force Base. I can remember sitting in an F-16, and that's where that seed was planted. I went to air shows my whole life. I'm always the guy that I live pretty close to an airport, and if there's a helicopter or plane that flies by, kids have to get out of the way as I run outside to see what just went overhead. So I've always wanted to do it. And, in a way, there's some similarities between, maybe you leaving your business or your job to do something else and me flying planes is, for me, what happened is, so I lost my dad in 2020, and he was 66 years old. At the time, I was 43. And one of the, I guess, things around that really shocked me is I looked up and I realized there might be only 23 more summers or 23 more Christmases or 23 more, birthdays with my kids. And, I was looking at my life and I'd enjoyed success financially, but I hadn't done a lot of traveling. I'd done some. And one of the big things is I had wanted to fly. And that was a conversation with my wife where I'm really grateful that she was willing to set aside her fears and recognize, hey, this is something that Ellen is going to need to do. And it's now become a very, very big part of my life for all the reasons that you mentioned. I fly to San Diego every week, Eric, so I'm living.
Now, I mean, I remember I had you on my show, and I remember the story, of course.
Yeah.
I just wanted, I guess, for your listeners to hear as well. I mean, I think your story is amazing, right? So, and this like is such inspirational. So, I don't want you to think that I don't remember. I just wanted to hear. And I
Yeah,
think your
absolutely.
listeners, if they haven't heard this, they deserve to hear it again.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I was looking for happiness, and that's where I found it. I think you find it in travel. Um, and and I love, in fact, if you look, I have my core values written on my vision board that's off to my left here. And one of those is adventure. And I'm happiest when there is some sort of adventure in my life, and it doesn't have to be big. That adventure can be hiking with my kids, but to be able to, for work, to have to fly an airplane at least once a week is an incredibly powerful way to maintain my mental health and my level of happiness. It also happens to facilitate great conversations with my kids and experiences with them. It also is a great accelerator for business relationships and opportunities. So, aviation has become a big through line for obviously the Plane Success podcast is why I did that, because there's a strong connection for me between personal success, business success, relationship success, and my ability to fly an airplane. And that's what I love about it. So I appreciate you asking that question.
Yeah, of course. I mean, as it's funny. So again, I just looked it up as you were talking. Episode 144 of my podcast, and it was a great show, and I learned a lot about you. The last 5 minutes were incredible. I remember vividly, but I think your listeners deserve to hear that too. And so, as the guest, a lot of times you end up talking a lot, but as the host, it's so important that people hear that joy. I mean, your voice even comes alive when you talk about flying and adventures. So that's super cool. I'm really glad you were able to share. So thanks for answering.
Oh, and thank you for asking. It's probably one of those things that I need to be really careful about feeding that addiction, because it doesn't get any less expensive as you progress in aviation. And at least for me, the desire hasn't diminished at all to fill that. So somehow I've got to maintain balance between level of income and level of addiction with aviation, and that's a difficult balance for me to find. So hopefully you have more success with that, Eric.
Well, right now, so I fly, it's like on the calendar, I fly once a week. So I go and I fly, I spend about 3 hours. And you're right. I mean, even those 3 hours is pretty expensive, because then all of a sudden it's like, oh, I want the new iPad because it has the new blah, blah, blah. Or I want the new headset. You kind of, there's always the next thing. But for me, that's, I think in the future, to your point, my income probably needs to match that addiction, so to speak. It's still just a hobby for me. So it could become a very, very expensive hobby, but same time, it's really cool. I mean, it's kind of a whole different feeling than anything else you do. So it's pretty neat.
Absolutely. What's your favorite aviation experience so far?
Phew. Um, well, so there around here, there are these strips that nobody lands on, and they're actually fairly well maintained. So, for example, like Navajo Lake is a lake that's between Colorado and New Mexico. And on the south border of that lake, there's a strip there. And I bet you there's less than one landing a week, but it's paved and it's pretty nice. And so you can fly down the lake and like almost through these canyons and then land on that strip and get out. And you're the only one there. And it's an amazing view. And then jump back in the plane and fly again. And like, it's a pretty cool thing. I mean, it's pretty, people talk about landing like, in sandbars and stuff like over near Moab and stuff. And I hopefully will get there. But for now, like just being kind of the only one around there. And again, it has this sense of adventure to it. So I think for me, for now, that's probably the coolest thing that I do semi regularly.
Are your kids flying with you yet, Eric? And if so, how do they like that experience?
No, they haven't yet. Same story. My wife wants me to have a little more experience under my belt. There's like a little festival that they do here. The kids can jump in the plane. We'll go to that. I think that's next month. So they'll get to pretty soon.
Awesome. I'll share an experience that I had. The first time I went flying with one of my kids it was for my son's birthday, and I had just gotten my license like the week before. So less experience than you are right now. And we decided to fly to Sedona to get lunch for his birthday. And Sedona for a new pilot can be kind of tricky because the runway is up on top of this plateau. So you have kind of weird winds sometimes that come up off the face of that plateau. And as I've gained experience, those winds aren't tricky anymore. You just expect them. But I'll never forget, we came in the first time to land and got caught by some of those winds, and it blew us, I don't know, 15 or 20 feet high. And so I went around, and then the second time, the exact same thing happens. We go around. So the third time we're coming back into land, and I'll never forget my son saying, "Dad, are you actually going to land the plane this time?" And I thought, I'm trying. I haven't quite figured out how to get it down on that darn runway yet. And, I have found, at least for me, in fact, just earlier today, as I'm preparing for a speaking engagement, I was going through some of the photos that I have in the plane with my kids, and there have been such great opportunities. Not just that we've had a good time. There've been a lot of those, waiting for my son to fall asleep, for example, and then nosing the plane over so that you get a zero gravity experience and he's bouncing off the ceiling of the plane. That's fun. But also we've been able to serve with it, where we did Christmas for a family that lived up in the Four Corners area and loaded the plane up with gifts for, this kid that was going through some medical challenges. And my daughter got to come with me and deliver those gifts. And we had this adventure and did something really good. So I'm excited, Eric, for you to experience some adventures that with your family that I think they'll remember for the rest of their lives. I now have my oldest son is working on becoming a pilot, and I think because of some of the experiences that we've had together have created some excitement and energy and happiness in his life as well.
So cool, man. That's so cool. Yeah. What a cool gift to pass on to.
So a few times you've mentioned mentors or coaches, and now you're doing that. So I'd love to know what effect relationships have had on your trajectory, your career, and also your investing now. And then also, how do you foresee that? And tell us a little bit about the coaching you're doing so that if somebody is just starting out, they have somebody they can turn to look for some coaching.
Yeah, I believe in it so strongly. Like in fact, the coach that I started with in 2019, he's still my coach. And every time the 6 months comes up, I'm like, should I change or, mix it up a little bit? But he still challenges me to this day. And so I believe in it strongly, so much that I've been paying for 5 years. But basically for me, my personal story was that I shared we had some success in single family stuff. And I met him at a meetup that he was running. And I just offered to help him run it, just because, it seemed like he had a little bit on his plate, and he runs a meetup differently than I do now. He's since moved and I took it over. But I was just like, look, I can bring snacks and beer or whatever, and help you organize this. And that's kind of how our friendship started, because he's like, well, no one has asked me to help. And I guess it was just my personality, I suppose. But anyway, so it turns out he was doing syndication. I was like, well, what is that? Just didn't even know what it was. And so that was the first time that we really met. And then we became sort of friends, and eventually he became my mentor and as like a traditional coach setting. But I will tell you, my life would be nowhere near what it's like now without having that mentorship because, I wouldn't have known the pitfalls or things to do or not to do. And so that relationship has blossomed. We've done quite a few deals now together, and we're just close friends. We host a event in Denver every year now, so like it's just kind of blossomed into this really cool partnership and friendship. And for me, I just want to pass that on, right? So like, if you're starting out, you don't know what you don't know, and so to have someone on your side to say, "Here's the next 5 steps." Rather than spin your wheels in this direction, you can go this direction. Or then even more importantly, if you get a deal in a contract, all of a sudden you're like, oh my gosh, or someone accepts an LOI for the first time on a multi-million-dollar deal that you have never really understood what it takes to close, to have someone in your corner and say, look, here's the next 10 things you need to do. Here's what you don't need to do. Here's what you're missing in the contract. Not only that, but like context, right? So like just to have someone in your corner to say, yes, I know you feel overwhelmed. I did too. And here's how I'm going to help you get through that. Those kinds of things are incredibly valuable. And then beyond that, it's like a mindset thing. So once you get past the first 2 deals, then it's all right, now you're running a business, and how can you sustain that well? And then the next, just continue kind of that growth in your mind. And for me, that was the huge part of it too, was like it shifted from real estate coaching into like mindset and growth. And that's where I think a lot of value comes from as well. So, I mean, again, I personally gain a ton of value, but I also really love watching someone be like, hey, I want to take the next level in real estate, to really taking that, right, and closing a deal and be like, oh my gosh, I did it. And it's like, I didn't do it. They did all the work. I don't do any of the work. I'm just there to help guide them, right? And it's super exciting to be part of that. So I have a lot of passion around coaching. That gets me pretty excited to watch someone really experience the ability that they definitely have within them. And that's true for me too. There's nothing special about me, just basically like consistency and a good mentor. And you can move that ball forward quicker than you think.
So, Eric, we've talked a lot about successes, moving out of your job into real estate investing, the progress that you've made, coaching, adventuring around the world. What are some of the most difficult challenges that you've experienced that have made this difficult that maybe not a lot of people get to see? Because I think it's easy. We start talking about the wins that we've had and people look at that and go, well, there's no way I can do that because X, Y, or Z thing is going wrong in my life or whatever. So what have the difficult challenges been that have required some perseverance or shift in your mindset to overcome?
Yeah, I mean, I think I had quite a few. And this is one thing that I think, like on my podcast, I like to be very honest too, because I think social media specifically is like, yay, it's the best ever and it's super easy and all smiles, right? But in reality, it's hard work, and there's also things that do go wrong. So first of all, I think mental health is incredibly important. I learned a couple of huge lessons. My dad had a stroke a few years back, actually it was like 18 months back, and it changed my world in mental health. And so I encourage people to like really evaluate where you are. Like for me, I typically would have these highs and lows throughout seasonal times.
Yeah.
And I was almost too prideful to talk about it. Like it turns out that that's very common. And it turns out that there are some things that you can do to help that. So that's one, I think probably more important than any other business is like, there's a shift in mental health and that's a really good thing. It's okay to see a therapist. It's okay to even like look at some medicine if that's something you need, right? Like that is way more important than anything else business wise. And I did a whole episode with my brother on this. Is like, there are times when you feel down. Let's all surround each other and help each other and be honest, right? Like, is there a person you can reach out to? And if you don't, then find that person and spend the time on your mental energy and mental health. So sorry, I'll get off my soapbox, but I think that's really, really important.
No, I think that's so important. I would love to know, are there daily practices that you employ to maintain your mental health? I have mine, but I would love to hear what yours are.
I think for me, and everyone's different, right? For me, the number one thing is exercise. So I will say I need to get my heart rate up most days. I would say 6 out of 7 days Otherwise, I can honestly feel a difference. Same goes in the winter. I need to be extremely diligent about exercise because as much as I like skiing, the winter is sort of gloomy for me. And so just being a little bit cognizant about that. During that time, my dad was struggling. I made him go to therapy. And I say made because that really was how it was, right? He was not interested. And what was interesting is he was like, "Well, do you see a therapist?" And it hit me like a ton of bricks. I was like, "No, I've never done that." And so it challenged me. I'm like, you know what? What do I have to lose? So I still go to therapy regularly now, which is a practice that like I think has had sort of a negative connotation for whatever reason. But I gained so much from it just to talk to somebody and be real and open and honest about it. My daily practices are a morning routine. So coming back to your question is I wake up and I do yoga every morning and I spend time alone really considering how grateful I am. I think a practice of gratitude is really, really valuable. And then what I do is like spend that time alone, basically considering what it is that I'm doing that is either bringing joy or not bringing joy. And what are some things I can do more of or cut it out? And then the final thing is exercise for me personally. And so there's a long answer again to your question, but those practices help me a whole lot.
Yeah, and I think that's so worth underscoring too, because that is of so I lost my dad to a stroke, so I know what it feels like to get the text message or get the phone call, Dad's had a stroke. I'll never forget where I was standing when I got that message. And that was on the back of losing both of my wife's parents the previous year. And so for me, developing regular, consistent daily practices that maintain a higher level of mental health and emotional clarity and health is critical. And a lot of them are similar. Now, I walk in the morning. I'm an extreme early riser. I take early rising to an extreme level. I'm usually up by 2:30 or 3 o'clock in the morning,
Oh,
and I go
that
for a
is
walk.
extreme.
Yeah, I usually will walk 4 or 5 miles before 4 o'clock in the morning. And while I'm doing that, I have affirmations that I listen to. It's recorded in my own voice, reading to myself what I believe I can accomplish over the next year. And I listen to that every morning. Then I journal as I'm walking, just an audio recording. So sometimes those come out really weird looking because I don't usually go back and edit them. And then the same thing, I walk through my day, through my week, through the next month. What do I need to accomplish to get to where I want to go? And that's every morning. And then from there, I go to the gym and do some weight training. And like you, I know when I miss one of those days, if I'm traveling or something and I can't get into the gym, I can feel it right away. And just maintaining those consistent practices for me that are meditation, exercise, journaling. I love the gratitude practice. For me, there was a self-love practice where I mentally would walk back into my past and look for things that had been afraid of, or things that I was ashamed of, or maybe places where I didn't show up as the person I wanted to be, and walk back to that version of myself and tell myself that out loud, Alan, I love you, and I want you to come with me into the future. I think identifying and doing those things is so critical. And I think especially as men, but probably men and women, we're a lot quicker to hire a health coach to teach us how to get our body in shape than we are to go hire a therapist or a coach that's going to help us with our mindset, not recognizing that it's the same material. Your brain is a physical thing that needs to be exercised and it needs to be trained, and we don't have all the tools to do that. So I love that you've emphasized that today.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I don't think you can emphasize it enough. Again, this is so much more valuable than business. But I'm happy to share some failures or some challenges in business as well. So that someone's listening saying, "Well, what about real estate, right?" Um, so if you're okay with that, I can share,
Yeah, let's
especially
do it.
one. Okay. So we bought a property last year, and we knew that the seller was a distressed seller, and we didn't really know exactly why, but we could tell. And the broker knew some information, but not a lot. Basically, they were in financial trouble. So we were buying this property at a very low basis because we were taking over the property itself. What we were being told was it was 90+% occupied and blah, 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 blah. all this stuff. And what we found when we closed essentially was he was being sued by his investors for falsifying basically everything. And he did that to us as well. He even was allowing people to live on the property for free so that the property even looked at our inspections more occupied than it was.
Oh my
And we
gosh.
found out it was really, truly only 40% occupied as far as the leases were concerned. So even the rent rolls and the T12, everything we got was a lie. And we could have never really seen that coming. I'd never experienced anything like it. I'd always thought a true T12 and a true rent roll, maybe slightly falsified or just maybe, but what's the reality that that's going to be so off that, it was just incredibly off. So now we're like, oh my gosh, we own this property where we are way deeper than we thought. And to have to just go back to investors and say, look, we're probably not going to see a distribution for 18 months. And this is on us. We're super sorry. The good news is we bought at a very low basis. So we think long term, it's going to be a fine investment for everybody. But that punch to the gut of, oh my gosh, out of 100 units, 60 are truly, economically vacant. Then to start the process of evicting people, and then to start the process of start to turn these units of evictions, which are typically pretty bad. Like, it was just a really, really challenging, it continues to be a challenging project. That is one of 12, right? The other 11 are performing fine, but that one's like, I lose sleep, right? Like, I wake up and I'm like, man, what could we have done differently? Or what can we do to save money and get this thing occupied? Because it's really what we need to do. The again, icing on the cake is now we're well into that process. We're getting very close to where we should have been by now. But it was just way more work and way more challenging conversations. Because if you're an investor, it's like, what the heck? Like, I trusted you, right? This is what I was saying. But I've always been very, very honest. It's like, we didn't see it coming. I don't know how we could have, but learning the lesson of, not wholeheartedly trusting those things has been a good one. So that's one very, very good example of an extreme challenge. And that makes, it makes for lessons learned, but hopefully it comes out to be a good return. Hopefully we'll see how it plays out.
I love that you shared that. One of the things I've shared with my kids is that no matter how you get education, it's going to be expensive. You can pay for it in college, or you can pay for it through life experience. You're going to pay for it one way or another. And what I love about hearing about that is, number one, that you owned it. Yeah, we made a mistake. We didn't see those things. But I bet you have processes and procedures and practices now in place that you didn't have before to prevent similar fraud from happening. And so you're paying a price now, but that price will yield tremendous profits in the future, not only for you, but for your investors, because you gain that education now.
Oh yeah. Oh, there's no doubt. And we walked away from a deal not too long after that had a similar sort of feel to it. It was like, I don't know if I trust the situation. And so we're going to be way more cautious about those things. It's funny looking back, I don't know what I would do differently. And sometimes the lesson's crystal clear. It's like, I would never do that again. But in this case, I'm like, you know what? Like, doing it all over again, I just think it was an extremely fraudulent person. And so sometimes you're just going to have to roll with the punches. So the lesson learned is we're talking about what's the worst case scenario. It's pretty bad, but I still think we can salvage a really solid return, which is nice, right? To learn a really hard lesson and still hopefully be able to deliver some returns. Our investors are not super excited. I'm not either so far, but I think by the end of it, hopefully we can turn it around. But yeah, you're right. It's an expensive, challenging lesson to say the least, but I hope that we can come out on top.
Absolutely. So Eric, at the end of each show, what I love to do is, my dad used to always say to me, Alan, remember the little things. In fact, he said it often enough that that's now what's on his headstone, is remember the little things. And so as you look back over your life, adventuring as a pilot, in business, in real estate, what are some little things, some little lessons that you would either pass on to people that you're coaching or to your kids that you think would be critical to their happiness and their life success? What would those little things be?
It's interesting you say that. It's funny. What I would say is I think it's probably different for everyone else. So like what I share may not even resonate with anyone else. But for me, I think becoming a father has made the little things way more important. And
Yeah.
maybe not important, just maybe just somehow it's like opens my mind to how quick it goes. So my oldest is almost 7, which blows my mind because, I say with parenting, the days take forever, but the years go by really fast. Some days are very long. It's like, oh my gosh, we are we get to bedtime. But what's interesting about saying that is, on the other hand, it's the tiny, tiny little things of like, we just rode bikes this weekend. And like my youngest, like just watching him ride and the pure joy and like, it's so simple, but I love mountain biking and to watch him like have some joy, even just the smile on his face. I'm like, that was worth all the effort to get here and, all the
Yes.
gear and everything, right? But that little thing is so, so valuable and so worth it to me. So like that's what pops into my mind is like watching my kids grab a little bit of joy out of some things that it took effort for us to provide or be there or whatever. That's kind of how I feel about travel too. It's interesting, like when you think about traveling somewhere, you think, oh, the most expensive thing or like the most adventurous thing will be the most like memory when in reality, usually it's the little stuff. Like for me, sometimes it'll be like my kids like snuggling me in a hotel bed, and that's more important to me than the very expensive, I don't know, excursion or whatever. You know what I mean? So it's like those little things. So I love what your dad used to say. That's such a cool thing to share.
That's awesome. Thanks for sharing that. If I could summarize, it sounds like at the beginning when you talked about leaving your job, and now when you're talking about leaving your kids, a through line that I'm seeing there is just don't be afraid to make the effort to make a change. To make an effort to spend the time with your kids, to go on the trip, to make a career change or a life change, to hire a coach, hire a therapist, and that making that little bit of an effort sounds like it yields oversized results. At least it has for you.
Yeah. One of the sayings my wife and I say is if we don't like something, change it. And that's easier said than done, right? But like if we feel like something isn't serving us or we're not grabbing joy, the effort, you're right, it does take effort, but it's usually worth it. And the same goes for adventure. I mean, traveling, like I said, with kids takes a lot more work, but it's almost always worth it, at least from my perspective. And then shifting, it's the same for bigger things. Shifting your career, that's a huge thing, right? Especially if you put a bunch of time, energy, and money into it. But if you're not enjoying it, like you only get one chance at this life. So it may take some time. Like for me, and it sounds like for you, it takes years to make that total shift. Absolutely worth it. Like looking back now, I'm like, wow, I cannot imagine myself continuing to click that same mouse, drawing that same road or whatever, right? Like, and I'm not meaning to even like be mean to engineering because I think some people love that. If that's your joy, absolutely good for you. It's great. It just wasn't mine. So I think the effort to change and even change my like like my my title, right? Like I was this professional engineer and like to change that into like now I'm a real estate investor. It took a major shift in mindset and even how I presented myself to people, but it's totally worth it.
Absolutely. Eric, this has been a lot of fun. Thank you for spending some time with me. If people are interested in coaching or interested in investing with you, how do they find you so that we can send them your way?
Oh, it's awesome. Well, thanks for that. Wild Oak Capital. Wild Oak Capital has basically everything there. My email is Eric, ERIC at Wild Oak Capital, and I always answer emails. So if people are interested to just talk or learn about our adventures or coaching or anything, yeah, reach out. I'd love to connect.
Engineering adventure one day at a time. I love it, Eric. Thanks again for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
Eric Nilsson has been engineering adventure in his life through business, real estate, travel, and now in aviation. For some people, just figuring out how to engineer a trip to get the medical care that they need is a difficult leap of faith and can be a real challenge. The pilots and the staff at Angel Flight West are here to solve that challenge. We provide free, non-emergency flights for people in need of medical care far from home. We also do relocation flights for victims of domestic violence or abuse. We provide free flights for military personnel, active duty and retired. If you are looking to solve a difficult transportation problem, please look us up, www.angelflightwest.org, and a pilot like me would love to provide an engineered opportunity for you to get the care that you need or help you get to where you need to go to improve your life and your situation. angelflightwest.org.